You've heard a lot, I think, about how to engage people and how to attract their attention, and a little bit of this is about that, but it's mostly about how to try to escape all that if you actually succeed at it. So first I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I got interested in this in the first place. I'm a journalist. I am particularly interested in covering crime and covering scam artists, con artists, people who change their identity from one identity to another. And the sort of ultimate pinnacle of that is someone who fakes their own death. And I've been collecting stories of people who fake their death for years and years. And there's a famous one in the UK a few years ago, and there are a lot of them in the US. And if you start looking at local newspapers, you'd be surprised how many of these you find. So a couple of years ago, I found this guy. And I love this guy. His name is Marcus Schrenker. He's from Indianapolis, Indiana, in the States. And he's a very successful person, as you can see from this photograph. He has not one, but two Lexuses pictured here. Beautiful wife, a plane. He's actually an amateur pilot. But he was a kind of investment advisor. And so he was advising people on their investments, taking their money, investing it, doing very well. It turned out that he wasn't actually investing all the money. And when the economy started going down, the authorities started looking into his business. And he realized, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. So he came up with a plan. And the plan was to fly a plane south from Indianapolis towards the Gulf of Mexico. Over Alabama, he was going to jump out of the plane. The plane would crash. No one would find the body. It would crash in the water. And then after that, he would just go off into a new life and start as a new person. So he went and executed this plan. And there were a couple of flaws in the way that he designed his fake death plan. One of which was that he didn't put enough fuel in the plane. So the plane didn't actually crash in the Gulf of Mexico, it actually crashed in Florida. He was kind of lucky that it didn't kill a lot of people. The second flaw was that if you radio the tower as he did and said, hey, my plane is having trouble, the windshield has exploded, I think I'm going down, what the radio tower does now since 9/11 is they send up a fighter jet to fly alongside, and in this case the Navy fighter jet radioed back and said, well actually, there's no one in this plane, and the door's open. So, his plane crashed, and then he had a third, perhaps more minor error that wouldn't have cost him so much if the plane hadn't crashed on the ground, which is that he had a book of campgrounds, and he left it in the plane, except he had torn out 2 pages of campgrounds in Florida, and so the U.S. Marshals, they found another book with the 2 pages in it, and they went to those campgrounds and they found them. Now, all this was kind of funny to make fun of him about, but what I was interested in actually was when he went to trial, he was going to plead not guilty. In fact, he originally pled not guilty. And then they brought him the evidence they had gathered, most of which came from his laptop, in addition to all of the above, most of which came from his laptop. And on his laptop back at his home, they had found all of his Google searches, which included things like how to jump out of an airplane at 12,000 feet with a parachute, what happens when you radio the tower. You would think if he did all this Googling, he would have avoided these previous problems. But that got me interested in not just people who fake their deaths, but the sort of digital trail that we all leave behind, that we're all creating every day, that in this kind of extreme case, it sort of shows the impact of the fingerprints, the footprints of your actions online. So I wrote a story about people who fake their own death, but in the process of that, my editor and I decided that the best way to really approach this, to really see what it was like to change your identity and what it would take to do that in the digital age, was for me to try it myself. So what we decided to do was I would disappear. I would try to disappear for a full month. Anyone could find me. If they found me, took my picture, and said a code word, they could win $5,000. So there were a couple of other rules to this, one of which was I couldn't go completely off the grid, because while you can be found, if you're completely off the grid, in the course of a month it wasn't really fair for me to go live in a tent somewhere in the woods. So I would try to actually reinvent myself under a new identity with a new name and stay online in the sense that I would try to do all the things I would want to do if I was reinventing myself as a new person, if I'd actually, let's say, fake my own death. And then my editor would serve as a kind of lead investigator, let's say. He would have access to all of my bank accounts, credit cards, email, every digital aspect of my life he would be able to access. And then if I used any of it, any of my old life, he could put that out online in a blog. So the idea was people could take that information, run with it, gather what they could, and see if they could catch me. Now, I started out, so these were photos that appeared in the September issue of the magazine. So this was right when I started. The magazine hit the newsstands. There was this sort of mugshot type creepy photos of me. And then there was a little dossier about who I was and that I was disappearing, and some basic facts that an investigator might find in really a few days if they were to interview my friends and family members, that I like to watch English football, that I have celiac disease so I can't eat anything with wheat in it, and a few things like that. So what did I do? Well, I started a couple of months before trying to build this other identity. So if I was going to leave my own identity, I had to have one to fall into. And these are some of the things that I created. They're sort of a fake ID. Now, I couldn't really break the law in a severe way because I was going to have to write about it afterwards, and I didn't want to get in serious trouble. So I mocked up a kind of fake academic ID. I had fake business cards. And my name was James Donald Gatz, and there were a couple of reasons for that. One is it's the name of a character in The Great Gatsby. It's actually the character who changes his name to Jay Gatsby. His original name was James Gatz. So it was kind of a funny play on this piece of American literature, but also, if someone Googled me, I wanted them to have a reason why they couldn't find out anything about me. And one possible reason was that I was named the same name as this character in literature, and there are thousands and thousands of student reports and discussions and literary analysis about this person. I had to do something about money, so I used these, I don't know what the sort of equivalent is here, but they're cards that you buy with cash, and they work kind of like credit cards. They're more like debit cards, really. You buy them for $200 cash, you can use them in a store, you can also use them online. And you can do things like register them online to a fake name and a fake address. And then you can use that online card to buy another online card which has your name on it, which looks kind of like a credit card. And in many cases, I would use that to sort of pass as my ID. I got an office, and one of the reasons for that is that there's so much digital connection these days that investigators often find people by connecting something. If they've tried to change identities, they connect something from their old life to their new life, whether it's they changed one number in their birth date, or they received some mail at their old apartment that is in the name of their new identity. So I need to have a completely separate place to receive mail, to receive those bank cards and things like that. So I had an office that I was able to rent online completely anonymously under my fake name, paid for by those online credit cards. I had a limited liability company. I was registered completely anonymously in the state of New Mexico, which is the only place where you can do so completely anonymously. I had a website, and so I sort of made up this identity. I mean, it's not dissimilar to, I mean, it is dissimilar to the cat, but it's sort of in the same vein as I wanted to seed the web world with some of my identity so that when I dropped into it, there would be something there. And that included this business, which I called Bespect. And I used to tell people it was like respect with a B, which doesn't mean anything. But it was a kind of research firm. It had sort of vague goals, helping people research things in different parts of the country. I had different projects I could talk about. And on more than one occasion, people looked up this website as a verification of my identity. In the sort of intelligence world, they call it a backstop. So someone would say, well, I'm not sure about this guy. So they would look it up, and then they would come back and say, oh yeah, I saw your company. It looks like a really interesting company. I had a Twitter feed for my daily goings-on. I had a Facebook page. And one of the challenges of getting on Facebook if you're starting an entirely new identity is that normally, if you or I were to jump onto Facebook for the first time, we usually do so because someone would invite us to be on. And then we'd friend them, and then we'd friend their friends and our other friends and family. Pretty soon we got a couple dozen friends, maybe up to hundreds. But in this case, I didn't have any friends. I was starting off as an entirely new person. So how do you gather friends if you have none? And it turns out a good way to do it is to find people who will friend anyone. And there are many such people on Facebook. A lot of them sell real estate or they do multi-level marketing, and they're very happy to friend you no matter who you are so that you can increase their number by one. So pretty soon I had, a couple dozen friends, at least enough so that if I met someone, they would not go to my Facebook page and say, who is this loser who doesn't have a single friend? I'm not possibly going to friend this creepy person. So I set off. I was living in San Francisco at the time. I won't take you through all of my travels, but I drove to Las Vegas. I sold my car. I started taking different forms of public transportation. I hitched rides. I hitched a ride with a band across most of the country. I ended up settling in Louisiana, in New Orleans, and that was the place where I was sort of going to reinvent myself. And I want to talk a little bit about how I stayed online. So one of the big dangers, of course, if you are going to try to disappear, but you're going to keep using the internet, is that every time you log onto the internet, and most of you are probably familiar with this, your computer has something called the IP address, which is, it's basically the address of your machine on the internet. And if someone has your IP address, they can find your location. It's correlated to your physical location. Now, in most cases, it's correlated to the public can only access, you know, let's say if I logged on here, it might just say Dublin or an area of Dublin. But if an investigator were to have your IP address, you're pretty much sunk if you're disappeared. So I use this program called Tor, which basically disguises your IP address. I won't go through the technical aspects of it, but if I'm logging in from here, it would basically route my signal through a bunch of routers that people have set up all over the world, and it might look like I was coming from Iceland or Germany or California, and it makes it difficult to unravel. And then I needed a second line of defense, so I also had this office, which is in Las Vegas, also rented anonymously. It's a windowless office in a strip mall. And I had these two laptops set up there, which they themselves were connected to the internet. And then if I wanted to access the web, I would log into these computers remotely from a laptop that I was carrying with me, and then they would be the ones that would actually connect to a website. So the idea was if someone did break down my layers of defense, they would only make it back to this office in Las Vegas, which actually they eventually did find this office in Las Vegas. So I also have to sort of try to change my physical appearance because unlike a normal fugitive, if someone saw me, they didn't even have to call the police. All they had to do was say a code word if they knew it. So if they're familiar with the contest, say a code word, take my picture, which most people can do with their phones. So I had to do a little bit to try to change my appearance. I grew this kind of scraggly beard at first, which wasn't terribly successful, and then I switched to this, which was kind of the Las Vegas look with really Harry Potter glasses. I dyed my hair, I dyed my goatee, I had fake glasses, I had fake contacts. And then I switched to this. This is sort of similar, but this is when I was in Los Angeles. I spent a few days there, and you'll notice that I'm sort of being interviewed there. And it's because I saw a news crew out on the beach near Venice Beach, and I said, you know what, I'm going to get into this video. I'm going to get interviewed in a man-on-the-street video, because what would be more funny at the end than to say to people, look, I was hiding in plain sight. I wasn't, you know, in a cave somewhere. I was actually on this video, and you still didn't catch me. And then this is me in New Orleans. I kind of settled in with this fedora, and I tried to look like a local, look like I'd lived there for years. And I rented an apartment. I signed a lease. I rented one apartment anonymously, another actually went in and signed a lease, and that was the guy who looked at my website as sort of my bona fides of you know, that I was worthy of renting this apartment to. So I'm living in New Orleans. I'm feeling pretty good. I've been there for about 3 weeks. And so what was everyone else doing? And the first thing they were doing was they were organizing. So when the magazine came out, it took maybe a couple of hours for people to start getting together and trying to figure out how they were going to solve this problem. Now, they could win $5,000 by catching me. $3,000 of that came from me. So we had sort of parallel opposing, I guess, incentives in this case. And it turned out it often wasn't about the money, the reasons they got involved, and I'll talk about that a little at the end, but from the very beginning, they used social networking to try to coordinate their efforts. A big problem for them was that not only did they not know where I was, but they had to physically find me. So even if they found me in New Orleans, if they weren't in New Orleans, they would have to figure out some physical way to come and take my picture, which a good way to go about that is to coordinate. So they had this Facebook page. Another thing I'll say about this Facebook page, I mean, it has, I think it had, 1,000 members after 4 or 5 hours, and it kind of built from there. And they're exchanging clues, and they have sightings, and they have, what did I buy on my credit card, and they posted my addresses and family members and all of this information. Later on, there was a Facebook group that was about helping me hide. Some people decided, well, I'm going to set up a opposing Facebook group, and that had like at 10, 20, 30 members at most. They set up websites, and oftentimes very elaborate websites with information that they had gathered, in some cases to try to lure me to the website so that they could get clues from me or find my IP address. But the main place they organized was Twitter, actually. And the reason was because using a Twitter hashtag, as many of you are probably doing right now, is a relatively simple way to kind of coalesce around a particular topic, and in this case, to swap clues. So they would post under Vanish. It sort of, on the first day, someone posted under the hashtag Vanish, and people started catching on, and you would see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of posts every single day. Now, there was a problem with that, which they quickly discovered, which was that I was actually on Twitter. So I had fake names on Twitter. I was following everything that was going on. So if they said they thought they knew where I was and they were close, I could see it. So they also moved into chat rooms that were password protected, and they went through all these elaborate measures to keep me out of the chat rooms because they didn't want moles to sort of come in and then reveal information about what they knew. And you can see, I don't know if you can read it very well, but you know, these things sort of went on throughout the day and the night, and people would pick up in different shifts. And it was a much smaller group in these sort of protected chat rooms, but it was much more effective because you didn't have new people coming in all the time with information that had already been gone over and proven to be false. These were people throwing out theories and tossing around ideas of how to find me, some of which were highly illegal, and fortunately they didn't follow through with.